إلى مدرجات استاد المدينة التعليمية. عشاق البرازيل ونيمار محمدي الذي لم يراه.
Pressure is a fascinating concept. The very presence of it makes people uncomfortable. However, for those that are able to appreciate it, it is a privilege. Pressure can help you realize your true potential, and those that embrace being placed with their backs against the wall will more often than not be able to reach deep down inside themselves and bring out the very best they have to give every time they're faced with it. However, for those that are not prepared for it or continue to harp on the disappointments of the past, no matter how talented the artist, the pressure they experience will feel like an anchor on their brain. Although the story going into each of the last 5 World Cups for Brazil have been drastically different, when it came to the most recent edition, they would once again suffer a similar fate. Dominating their group stage matchups, as well as their round of 16 tie, before falling to a European opponent in the quarterfinals under shocking circumstances. With the exception of 2014, of course, which resulted in the most embarrassing semi-final defeat of any team possibly in World Cup history. This time, it wouldn't be a golden era Belgian side or Zinedine Zidane's France, but an aging, over-the-hill Croatia side, whom although did still have enough talented players and coaching to be considered a solid squad, they should not be beating a Brazil team that was widely accepted as the most talented and informed side in the entire tournament, especially after the Seleçao had taken the lead in extra time via a magical run from Neymar. They would concede with 3 minutes left in extra time, eventually being dumped out on penalties, once again coming out of the World Cup as perhaps the most disappointing elimination of the elite teams. For Brazil, the last 5 World Cups have not only been unsuccessful, but from a winning standpoint, almost all of them have ended in disappointment and in some cases even embarrassment. Therefore, questions have been asked about the Brazilian national team, with many wondering how a team with perhaps the most historical significance, and even now, an embarrassment of riches in terms of talent and chemistry, have struggled dramatically to live up to their lofty expectations, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. Brazil were big favorites in 2022, as they always are. You see, the incredible history of Brazilian football has been so monumental to the evolution of the great game that the expectations anytime the famous yellow shirts of Brazil are playing are not just to win, but to dominate. And although this didn't seem to be an issue for the players who managed to be victorious in the eras of the past, the world was a much different place back then. The rise in social media and the mental effects that can be caused through the overconsumption of people's opinions online, as well as the constant criticism that seemingly flushes in, which are not as avoidable and intimate as it was 20 years ago, is a crucial nuance that athletes today have to understand and overcome on a daily basis. However, the players that represent Brazil carry more than just the weight of social media and public opinion on their shoulders. When a player is blessed with an opportunity to compete in the famous yellow shirt of Brazil, they are carrying the honor, pride, and courage of an entire nation, 217 million people in particular. The Seleçao are widely regarded as the greatest international side in the history of football. Leading all countries with a record-setting 5 FIFA World Cups, Brazil are a nation that attributes its identity, image, and reputation on the historical success of the national team. The South American side have had a long and storied history of birthing some of the most important players and teams to ever grace a football pitch. From the legendary days of Garrincha and Rivellino to the incredible era of R9 and Ronaldinho, the Brazilians have been the epitome of excellence in football, standing alone as the measuring stick for everyone to observe and try to emulate. Capturing their first 2 World Cups in back-to-back tournaments, Brazil have been flexing their football muscles ever since 1958. Their 3rd World Cup victory would come off the back of another incredible showing from Pelé, a man who shortly after winning with Brazil in 1970 would become the equivalent of a god in football, widely regarded at the time as the greatest the game had ever seen. And when he retired from international football in 1971, many around the world were anxious to crown another prodigy to be the next Brazilian star. And this had started a trend that evolved from Zico to Rivaldo and from Ronaldo to Kaká. Brazil would go on to conquer the world twice more, first in 1994, then 8 years later in 2002, sailing off the waves of some of the most talented squads in history, whilst also always operating around their megastars. However, in the 2 World Cup campaigns that would follow since their successful triumph in 2002, Brazil would get bounced out in back-to-back quarterfinals against European opposition. In 1994, it was the era of the legendary Romario. In 2002, the superpowers of Ronaldo were on full display for the world to bear witness. However, in the present day, as well as the last decade of their history, Brazil have been operating under the era of the incomparable Neymar, a flamboyant talent from the outskirts of Sao Paulo who has been stamped as the next great player to lead Brazil to the promised land since his professional debut for Santos at age 17. However, whilst Neymar has definitely solidified himself in the history of Brazilian football, one that will be remembered for not only being the joint top goal scorer for the Seleçao, but also for winning the Confederations Cup in 2013, as well as capturing Olympic gold in 2016, scoring the winning penalty in the shootout against Germany in the final, Ojoya has failed to lead his nation even remotely to the same level of success as his predecessors, not being able to capture a Copa America nor a World Cup since he's joined the senior team. In an era of Messi and Ronaldo, a strong argument could be made that Neymar has been the player under the most pressure in the last decade. Keep in mind the aliens of our generation have only dealt with the reality of the social media age we currently live in for about the second half of their careers. The global notoriety that Neymar attained as a 13-year-old boy on the streets of Brazil was essentially completely a product of social media and online videos. Some of my earliest memories of Neymar are from watching his skills on YouTube clips and from seeing people talk about him on Facebook. Neymar was one of the first mega-viral sensations of the new age, meaning even from his earliest years as a footballer, without the fame, money, and lifestyle he currently lives under, he was still the subject of praise, criticism, and debate. By the time Neymar made his professional debut for Santos at 17, he was already one of the most well-known athletes in the world. And although many were quick to coddle and glorify the talent and potential of the young Brazilian, as time had wore on, his support had turned to dissent. When Neymar joined PSG in the summer of 2017 for an unprecedented €222 million, he would unknowingly open the floodgates of hate and criticism towards him, as everyone, from pundits to fans, had an opinion on his decision to leave Barca for Paris Saint-Germain. Many accused the Brazilian forward of only being motivated by money. Others presumed he only left Barca because he no longer wished to play behind his best mate, Lionel Messi, while others conspired that the former Champions League winner was only concerned with the growth of his name and brand rather than his legacy in football. This, coupled with the fact that he was remembered more in the 2018 FIFA World Cup for the time he spent on the ground rather than anything he managed to do on the pitch, an avalanche of hate and criticism directed towards him would ensue from all directions. Even for Neymar, a person who's been familiar with the side effects of social media and public opinion since he was a young boy, the accumulation and significant increase of disdain and resentment by the general public every single year has become all too overwhelming for the Brazilian. It got so bad that Neymar himself had noted prior to the tournament that he believed the 2022 World Cup would be the last of his career, due to not being able to deal with the amount of mental anguish and stress that comes from the pressures of essentially being Neymar. Due to the storied history and successes of the Seleçao in many eras of the past, as well as the amount of talent still presently on display for Brazil, the expectation for them, no matter the competition nor the opponent, is always to win. And if anything but a win is achieved, it is perceived to those on the outside as both a shock and a disappointment. If this becomes a trend, as it has in the last decade or so, it creates a snowball effect, where in which the negative criticism creates an inability to disassociate from past failures, which in turn creates more pressure on players who really play best when they're playing football without added stress. And now after 5 straight unsuccessful World Cup campaigns, 4 of which ended in quarterfinals, it seems as though, even with a supremely talented squad, great coaching, top chemistry, and a tactical presence, the Brazilians just can't seem to break the cycle that they have cultivated for themselves in the last 2 decades. I would argue that although Brazil's 2006 and 2010 World Cup quarterfinal exits could easily be attributed to old age, lack of motivation, as well as the squad being in the midst of a transitional period from their golden era of the 90s, it goes without question in my thinking that the effect these losses had were the beginnings of a psychological hurdle that has only grown taller and more difficult to get through since the inception and rise of social media. I believe nothing is coincidence, and seeing Brazil struggle in the last decade or so, particularly in comparison to an Argentina squad that doesn't have the same talent as Brazil, but relies on their grit, hunger, and mental fortitude they have built off of their many shortcomings as their anchor and reason to win games, it shows me that the Seleçao's issues are a lot more down to mental and psychological factors as opposed to any physical ones. It would seem as though, more than a revamp of the squad or looking for a particular coach, the Brazilian FA should look into strategies that can help players let go of past anguish and focus on creating a story of their own. When Neymar broke down into tears after losing to Croatia many weeks ago, he was not only hurt about Brazil not being able to capture the World Cup for a 6th time, but also because, if this was his last World Cup, he understood in his mind that the consensus of his career will be that he was never able to lead Brazil to a significant trophy, and perhaps the painful reality of that scenario resorted him to tears, which now has put him in an awkward position where he's unsure if he still wants to play for the national team again. Make another run because this couldn't possibly be the end, or call it a career because the pain and frustration that could come from another loss could be all too difficult to bear. Ultimately, the story of Brazil is always a fascinating one. Due to their incredibly significant history, one that has transcended the sport as a whole and inspired millions around the globe since the 50s, even if Brazil failed to win the World Cup for another decade, they would still be considered favorites going into the following tournament, whatever that may be, because that, in itself, is the nature of Brazilian football. As they say, pressure comes from within, and so it must be mastered from within. As the quest for a resurgence in silverware continues for the Seleçao, the expectations and curiosity about the mental fortitude of the national team will no doubt hang in question. And only time will tell when Brazil's next golden era will eventually arrive. However, when it does, the contents of their wins and losses will be subject to a considerable amount of scrutiny, and rest assured, the world will be watching.